All right, so this project, you guys don't want to start covering methods or anything until you guys have conditionals down and you've already done your magic 8-ball project. All right, so we're going to start talking about methods. Methods are a way that we can better organize our code. We can break up the logic to make it easier for us to do much more complex things. So let's talk about what methods are. Okay, so when you think of a function, so if I say, y is equal to, let's say, mx plus b, or we have y equals 3x, or we have f of x is equal to x squared. All of these, when we have a value that we can put in to one of these functions, then we can do things with it. If we know what the slope is or the y-intercept, then we can plug it in. And then if we have those values and we know what x is, we can always find what y is. Or, vice versa. If we know what y is and we have the slope and the y-intercept, we can find what the x is. If I have a value for x, I know that I'm just going to multiply by 3, and that's what my value is for y. For my function f of x equals x2, if I put in f of 3 is equal to, I'm just passing that in, so I'm going to do 3 squared. So f of 3 is equal to 9. So we've seen these before. What the major difference is when we're looking at methods is really just kind of a jargon for computer programming, but it's how we break down the logic. So we can build these equations. So, let's say that we were going to build that one, okay? And all we have to do when we're looking at our methods is we really need to decide what we want the method to do, okay? And then we start building it in steps so that we're getting what that end product is. If the method is doing too much, then we want to break it down into smaller methods. The whole game plan of using methods is there's two ideas that you use when you are programming. There is the wet mentality, and there is the dry mentality. Okay, in programming, if you have to repeat yourself, that's what wet is. Wet code is where you are wasting everyone's time, writing everything twice. Okay, if you are putting yourself in a situation like this, the problem that you're going to have is that if there is a bug, you have to go through and fix everything multiple times. And it's not a good thing to do, because if someone else has to look at your code, they're going to end up having to look at a lot more code because you are writing things over and over and over. Okay, the dry method, what we strive to achieve in our code, is to don't repeat yourself. Okay, so if we have to say something twice, then we want to pull it out into a method. Okay, so this mentality, this idea, this should push you to look at your code and break down anything that could be reusable and to write a method for it to make it easier to call. The other reason why you'd want to use methods is because it does help to break logic down. That example where we had y equals mx plus b, we could have an equation for finding the slope. We could have an equation for finding the y-intercept. And we could have an equation for putting in for x to ultimately find what the y value for that coordinate pair is. All of that, we are breaking down steps. We normally do this in our head when we are thinking of how we're breathing or walking. We break down each thing into smaller and smaller steps. Okay, so looking at this in implementation. Okay, So we have already been working with methods. This is a method from the name of it to the end of the code block. Okay, that is a method. That is our main method. We have to have that into our program. Okay, and there's a couple things that make up a method. There is the access modifier. So and we're not really going to go into detail much on the access modifier because I'm not teaching you guys classes or anything during Computer Programming 1. So you always use public static. Void is saying what type we're going to return, if we're returning anything, the name of the method, and any parameters or anything that we need. So let's look at a quick way. So let's say I wanted to print out system.out.println, which is also a method that we're calling. It belongs to this system.out object. This is the method. But when we want to print something, you know, we've been saying hello and world. Okay. So this would be an example of us having to do this. If I wanted to write multiple methods to you know, say different things like stars, universe, okay, this is starting to feel kind of tedious. I am writing out system.out.println way too many times. Okay, so I am in a situation where I'm using wet code. Wet code means I'm writing everything, you know, at least twice. I'm wasting everyone's time because instead of them just looking at the code and checking the logic, they're having to look at each line by line and say, oh, okay, yep. It also increases the chance that I might end up having a small mistake. One that would probably get caught by my compiler, or one that may not, where I forget to put spaces in or something like that. Okay? So we want to write this as a method. Okay? Now, methods cannot be written inside of methods. So this is my main class, or my main method right here. And when I highlight next to one of my brackets, that is where the end of the method is. Okay? I have to be below that. Okay? I cannot be inside of these brackets to write a method. And so I'm going to start off with public static, and then I have to decide what type. So to start off, I'm just going to write void. This is what I want to do. I'd like to print out all of this stuff. So let's say that I wanted to make this a method. I could move that out and I could say print greetings. So I give it a name. And then if I have anything that I want to put in as a parameter, I put inside here. Okay. So then I can paste all my code here, and now I have created a method. It's not a very good method, but it is a method. So this was writing a method. Now if I need to call a method, that means I have to actually use the name of the method itself and pass in any requirements that it needs. Okay, so I could say print greetings, and I could run my code. And it's going to print all of those lines. All right, so that is the same as what I've previously had. Okay, so it's not a super difficult concept, but it is a different way of thinking. We want ultimately to print all of this. Okay, now let's look at what our method does. Our method is pretty much printing out everything, and it always starts with a hello and a space. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to create a method that I could pass in what I want it to print. So thinking about it in this way, where I know that it's going to print hello first, I could start writing up .println. I could start writing in what I want it to print. I know that it's going to print hello in a space. Okay, but now I want this and world, stars, and universe, and moon, those all change. So instead of just printing all those lines every time, I could make my programming a little bit more dynamic. So instead of writing this out verbatim for everything that I want to print, I could start creating some variables within the method, which is a way that we can reuse code. So instead of it saying print greetings, I can say, you know what, I require a parameter. The parameter is going to be of type string, and I'm going to give it, let's say, I'm going to give it the name noun. Now, whatever they type in there would be what I'm building my function or my method with. So I am going to use what they type in there, and this is now my method. Now this print greeting that I have is now, it has an error, and if I hover over it, it's saying that the print greeting, it's requiring a string and I didn't give it. So if I put something in there, so I could, to print the same thing, let's copy this a few times. Okay. And we're going to pass in world, stars, universe, and moon. Okay, in my print greetings. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. So now all I'm doing is I'm calling the same method over and over. This is an example of dry, or do not, or don't repeat yourself, because the only thing that is changing is what I am passing in. I am passing in the word or the string world, and I'm giving it a temporary value of noun. If I try to use that noun after my method and I say noun, I get an error. If I look at it, it's going to say that it doesn't know what it is. It's not the same thing. The word noun only exists inside this code block. Anywhere else it doesn't exist. I get errors. Okay, so it's like a temporary variable that we can use inside our code, and we can do it multiple ways. I could have another variable inside here. I could have int 5 or whatever, int number equals 5. This only exists inside of that method. Okay, so a lot of times when you guys are writing outside of the main method, it doesn't get recognized anymore. So now if I run my code, now it's not going to appear any different, but I'm writing my code more smartly. I'm breaking up the smaller logic pieces. I'm looking at what I wanted it to print, and then I'm making the changes. So now this method will literally print anything that I want with hello attached to it. Okay, which is a interesting way that we can try to improve on our code and have a different logic in there. So let's say that I wanted to, instead of doing this, let's say int a, and I give it a value 5, and int b is 6, and I wanted to do the sum of them. I say, well, system.out.println, and then I'm going a plus b, and I'm printing out. But if there are times where I'm going to add multiple things together, for example, the BMI, when we're doing some of our calculations, we could actually make some methods out of those. So if I know that, let's say, C equals A plus B, let's make that an int, and I'm going to keep going down, C plus A, that's going to equal D. Okay, I'm using multiple things. So what I want to do is I want to start using some methods. So I could go ahead and write another method. As long as I'm not inside of a method, I can go ahead and write one. So public static let's say this time we want it to actually return something. Well, what do we want it to return? We want it to return the sum. So I want it to return, let's say, an int type. Okay? And with that, I'm going to call it add. Yeah, let's just call it add. And we go ahead and we give it 2 requirements. In order for it to add 2 things, I need to have 2 numbers to add. So I could say first number, int, second number, and I go ahead and I build that. Now it's going to error out because it says missing a return statement. So ultimately I need to return something. I could return 2 and that's going to be wrong, but what I want to do is I want to use whatever requirements or whatever information that I put into the equation, I want it to use that. So I could say int answer is equal to first number plus second number, and I return the answer. Now I just wrote a method, so I could call that here. I could say add, and I could do A and B, or I could put A and a number because all of those are still ints. Here I could do the same thing, add A and B, add A, what was that? That was C and A. That's not, yeah. Okay, so if I ran these, I would have a method that is returning that stuff. Now, another way that I could write this is I'm ultimately returning the answer. So I don't technically need to use a temporary variable int unless I needed it for something. I could just return this whole thing right here. So if I copied that and pasted it here, this would do the same thing. So I could print out all of those. And I would still see, so let's do system.out.println, and we could print out what D was. So let's go ahead and run that. So it added 5 and 6 together, printed it out right here, and then I use the add function or the add method to add up C and A for D, and then I printed out D, and D was 16. Okay, so all this is, the only difference between this method is that instead of saying void, I am actually choosing what I want to return. And if I am returning something, I have to have the keyword down here of return. Now I can do this a lot of different ways. I could do for max number, min number. I could reorganize code. So I can have it, either it's just doing a small piece of logic, it's reorganizing my code, or it's printing out additional lines. And I could use this with the keyboard, the scanner, and take input from the user and be able to build out these methods. Okay, so methods, just to summarize, methods are a way that we can break down the logic. It's a way that we can use code that we have spent the time thinking about and planning out, that we can use it over. So when we are designing a method, we want to ultimately design what we want the method to do. We want to build it into steps. And we want to make sure that if the method is doing too much, that we should break it down into smaller methods. Okay? And as you guys seen, the values that I use inside the methods, they only exist inside the methods. I don't have access to those variables for the parameters outside of the methods. Okay. One more thing that I do want to show. So let's say I create another method, and I'm going to call it make number 500. Okay, and I'm going to pass in a number. All right. So if I say number is equal to 500, all right, so I have D as that 16 right down there. Okay, so let's print this out. We're going to print it out twice. And this is what I want you guys to take home from this. If I use the method, and I use that make number 500, and I pass in D, okay, what we would think is that this is going to print out 16. This method, and I'm going to go ahead and do system.out.println, and I'm going to write just some debug lines for you. Before number changes, and then I'm going to print out the value, so number. Now I'm going to print it out afterwards. After number changes, and then I'm going to print, and this is outside of the method after it is called. All right, so what do we think is going to happen? We have 16. I'm calling this method. I'm passing in the D in there, and I am changing it to 500. So the question is, would this stay as 16 or would it stay as 500? So let's go ahead and run it. All right, so before number changes, we're at 16. After number changes, we're at 500. Outside of the method, after it's called, it's still only 16. Okay, that is because this variable does not exist outside of the method. If I wanted it to be the value, then what I would need to do is either all the methods have to have access to that number to begin with, so I would have to be able to write D and have it recognize, which I will be showing a little bit later, or I have to reassign that number back. So I would want to say I want to return an int, and I would need to ultimately return what that number is. So return 5, or return D in this case, which would be number. Okay, so now if I return this, it's still not going to give me that value, because I still have to do something else. So that number is still 16. Just because I have a return type doesn't mean that I've done anything with it. Yes, this method is returning a value, but if I am ignoring the value, it doesn't do anything. However, I could reassign it back to the variable D and run it, and let's see what it does now. Now the value actually is 500 because I'm running this method, which is changing the number to 500, printing it back, assigning it back to D. Okay, and so when I print this out, it is holding that value. So that is where I would want to actually return things if I don't have access to them. Okay, so that is basically methods in a nutshell. A lot of understanding this is actually playing around with it, okay, which is what is going to lead into our next project. Okay, so watch the video. I would suggest that you guys try out the methods, create a you could use your math tester project, start putting in some of these, try out a couple methods, see what you think about them, and then come back for the next video where I'm going to go over the next project that you guys are going to be doing. All right, good luck, have fun.